Okay. All right. Reid Johnson, Associate Pastor of Christian Life Church here in Austin. If you will come have a seat. Can we give them both a round of applause for being here today? It's going to be an awesome experience for everyone. So Reid Johnson is an Associate Pastor, Christian Life Church here in Austin. Anything else that you'd like to say about yourself? People should know.
Yeah, I used to do youth ministry, so I used to work with high school students all the time. I did that for 8 years, and happy to be here. This is my first debate, so take it easy on me.
Yeah, I used to be youth minister as well, so that's cool. Matt Dillahunty, host of a TV call-in show here in the Austin area called the Atheist Experience, speaks all over the country, and just got back from the UK, right, speaking as well. Matt isn't feeling too well today, unfortunately, so...
We'll make it. I've been sick for 2 days, but we'll make it.
Okay, yeah, we should be extra grateful that he took the time to come here today because he's not feeling too good, and we'll be sure to be patient with you. That is about it for the opening. I'm going to let each of them give a 5-minute opening for their opening statements as we work through this. So each of you are going to have about 5 minutes to talk about your opening statements for the topic, do we have reasons to believe in God? Reid, would you like to start?
Sure.
Great, okay.
Well, thank you, Tim, for the introduction and for the invitation to be here at class today. Can I stand? Is that okay?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'm just going to put stuff right here. So, had you asked me 25 years ago to be a part of this debate, I probably would have sided with you, Matt, if I'm honest. 25 years ago, I grew up in a home that believed in God, and at 12 years old, my dad committed suicide. My dad and my best friend. And I was very angry at God. How could a loving God allow something so tragic to happen in my life? And I don't know if I ever would classify myself as an atheist, but I definitely wouldn't classify myself as a follower of God. Fast forward a few years, and I went to the University of Texas at Austin, hook 'em horns, and was a journalism major. I wanted to be a sports center anchor, and I took a class called Journalism and Religion. I started questioning, like, what happens when you die? Because I'll be dead a lot longer than I'll be alive, so I want to get that question right. Does worms eat my corpse, or will I meet God? Which God will I meet? I wanted to know the answer to that question. And so I took this class, Journalism and Religion, taught by Dr. Orlovsky, and we studied Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and Christianity and Mormonism, all the major religions of the world, and we looked at the major religious texts, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, the Bible, and then we had leaders of these faiths, so a Hindu priestess, a Buddhist monk, a Christian pastor come in, and we would try to refute their points, refute their faith. We try to debunk what they were saying as journalists, and if we did, we got graded well. At the end of the class, I was so convinced that not only was there proof that God existed, but that He was my true God, that I abandoned my dream of being a sports center anchor, and I went full-time into ministry. And one of the pieces of evidence that I uncovered in a book by Dr. John Blanchard, which is called As God Passes Sell-By Date, was he talked about the law of probability linked with fulfilled prophecy. And in the Bible, there are 1,093 prophecies that have been fulfilled. These are things that were predicted, that did not exist at the time, that were predicted, that started to happen. And very specific prophecies, things like that the Messiah will be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, says that in Zechariah 11, 12, and 13. And Matthew 26 says that he was. Things like in Psalm 22, it says the Messiah will be pierced in his hands and in his feet. And that was written 800 years before crucifixion was a form of punishment. So really specific prophecies. But in a book called Science Speaks, Peter Stoner, who's a professor at Westmont College in California, came up with 4 prophets from the Old Testament, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Micah, each of whom claimed to be speaking God's prophetic word. And he took 11 of their prophecies, okay, all about dealing with the land of Israel as a whole. So things that nobody could refute. Historians, scientists, archaeologists, they said these things happen. Like history records these things happen, but were predicted in Scripture. Dealing with the land as a whole, the destruction of Jerusalem, the later enlargement of the city, the rebuilding of the temple, really specific things. He said the likelihood that these 4 prophets could have gotten these 11 prophecies right by guesswork is 8 times 10 to the 63rd power. And then he puts it into terms that you and I can understand. He said it's like if you took 100 billion coins in each of 2 trillion galaxies. So 100 billion multiplied by 2 trillion. And then you added to that rate the same amount of coins, 100 billion times 2 trillion, every second for 21 years. And then you ask a blindfolded friend to pull out a coin from that incomprehensibly massive pile that you had marked in the beginning. The likelihood of them doing so is the same that these 4 prophets could have gotten these 11 prophecies right by mere guesswork. So surely, this is a different league than tarot cards and tea leaves and crystal balls. For me, I thought, it tells nothing of the story. We're talking about 11 prophecies of the over 1,093 that had been proven to the letter. And so for me, I thought, who could write that with such authenticity? Who could write that and be infallible except the one who knows it all, who created it all and put everything into existence? And for me, if I wrote a book and I said that you fell in a hole later, you fell in a gopher hole later today, and you made it 100 because you asked a question later, and you got home and your mom had cleaned the whole house, okay? And then you later today, you fell in a gopher hole, and you made 100 on your test, you got home, the house was a disaster. So I got 2 out of 3 right. What does it say about my book? Well, it's lucky, but I got something wrong. But when you have a book that has so many things right, what does it say about my book? And what does it say about the author? Are there reasons to believe that God exists? I believe so, based on prophecy alone. And I have to have more faith not to believe than to believe.
All right, excellent. That was 5 minutes for your opening. Thank you so much. Next is Matt's 5 minute.
Okay. Thanks for having me. Thanks for showing up. I apologize if you can't understand me from the cold, but I do what I can. Similarly, 25 years ago, I would have been on the other side of this. I was raised primarily as Southern Baptist. My folks thought I was going to be a preacher, but I decided that I cared about whether or not my beliefs were true, rather than whether they were comfortable or popular. How do we go about determining if we have sufficient reason to believe something? Well, we can't use faith, because you can use faith to justify anything. I could say, I believe bald people are superior to people with hair based on faith. And the opposite is true as well. I could say that I believe people with hair are superior to bald people. We can't just rely on personal experience, because we know about things like delusion. We know that we may not have a correct understanding of an experience that we had, so we rely on independent verification to make sure we're not deceiving ourselves. We don't just get to make inferences to say, hey, something happened and we don't have an explanation, but there's this proposed God explanation which would be sufficient, because the God explanations are intentionally designed to be sufficient. If you have somebody who can do anything, well, they could serve as an explanation for anything. But they don't actually serve as any sort of explanation, because we explain the unknown in terms of the known. Here's this new mystery, we need to go and solve it by appealing to things that we actually know and demonstrate. So for anything that we're going to try to have a good foundation, a foundation that's solid, that we're going to believe in, we need actual evidence. Now, it's no use to say that, well, God can't give us that kind of evidence, because if there is a God, it should know exactly what it would take to change our minds. It should know exactly the foundations of epistemology and thought that go into making a sound belief. If there's a God, essentially, it should know what the good reasons are for us to believe, and we should have access to those. We shouldn't have to rely on interpretation of personal experience or individual revelations. So either there's a God or there's not. If there's not, then we're done. The world in which there's no God is kind of the one that I apparently am looking at. But if there is a God, it still falls into one or two categories. Either it manifests in reality in some detectable way, or it's completely undetectable. We can get rid of the undetectable one, because that God looks exactly like the God that doesn't exist. And there are people who believe, who claim that they are detecting a God. So we have to be talking about some God that detects, that is detectable in reality. Otherwise, people are detecting the undetectable, which is an even bigger problem. And so if that's what we're talking about, then there should be evidence for it. Now, I'm not going to, at some point we'll talk more about prophecy. But my position here isn't that we can conclude there is no God, but that we cannot reasonably conclude that there is a God. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Some of you may be familiar with Carl Sagan's invisible dragon in his garage. But the easiest version is this. If my mom calls and tells me, hey son, I just bought a new car, I'm probably going to believe her just at face value because there's nothing extraordinary about that claim. We know people buy cars, I know my mom, I know she's generally truthful. But if my mom calls and says, hey honey, I was just abducted by aliens last night, I'm not going to believe that claim. I'll believe that my mom had some experience that she's honestly trying to relay to me as accurately as possible, but I'm not actually going to believe and accept her conclusion. And so the same thing happens when my mom says, hey, I prayed and God fixed this, or hey, we took a look at this prophecy and that's the only explanation. If we don't have a natural explanation for something, then we don't have an explanation. You don't get to just appeal to the supernatural and claim that those types of responses are somehow warranted and justified. They need their own evidence. There needs to be positive evidence for the proposition, not just, hey, we don't know. Oh, this is weird. We've all had some sort of experience. The most common arguments for the existence of God, things like the cosmological argument, which I imagine you guys might have covered at some point. The problem with that is God's never mentioned anywhere in the argument. Now, William Lane Craig, one of the foremost Christian debaters, presents the cosmological argument all the time. But the argument's really simple. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. That's the whole argument. God isn't mentioned anywhere in there. Why is it that after thousands and thousands of years of talking about this, instead of having hard evidence and good reasons, what we have are anecdotes, the same old arguments being trotted out, revamped over and over again, and we seem no closer to resolution on this issue of whether or not there's a God. If there was, wouldn't we have mountains of evidence that would warrant belief?
It's 5 minutes. Thank you so much, Matt. I meant to open with this. Those are really good opening statements, so I hope you guys copied a lot down from that. I meant to open with this, so I hope I can just say it now before we get into the rebuttal phase. Hope everyone here understands the purpose of today is not to sway you one side or the other. In fact, the whole purpose of today was not necessarily the argument on the board. It was to see a live debate. So what I want you guys to get out of this today, and I hope you guys don't mind me taking a minute to say this,
That's fine.
is pay attention to the techniques they're using. Pay attention to the arguments they're making. Are they using anecdotes? Are they using logic? Are you noticing fallacies and stuff like that? These are the things I want you guys to pay attention to. I'm glad they're debating about what we're debating now because I know you guys are interested in this topic. We've talked about this topic a lot in class. But regardless, the purpose of today is not to have you decide which one of these guys is right today. It's to get you to think, sure. But more importantly, I wanted you guys to see a live debate and see two people who are professionals, who have done this before, do a debate in front of you, okay? I just want everyone to keep that in your minds as you go through this. Each of you has 10 minutes for a rebuttal now, beginning with Reid.
All right. Well, first of all, let me just kind of go back to the first thing that I said, that the prophecy really, for me, has sealed the deal for my faith. There was a point in my life where I thought I wanted to have a factual side. You made a point a minute ago, Matt. You said that you can't go on faith alone. I agree with you. For me, I needed some facts for my faith. And over 1,000 prophecies coming to fulfillment, that, for me, did something. I love Sports Illustrated. I'm a big fan of sports, and I subscribe to Sports Illustrated. This is their 60th anniversary issue. And these guys, all they do is study sports. That's all they do. You have a baseball guy and a football guy and a basketball guy and a girl, and that's all they do is they study sports all the time. And they're trying to predict what's going to happen in 3, 4, 5, 6 months from now. Who's going to win the championship? And so this issue came out, and you can see the headline there, Regrets. And these are all the bogus fabrications, that these claims they made. These are overinflated, can't-miss prospects that were busts in their respective sports. And here, I don't know if you can see this, but there's a mixed history of our picking champions in the preseason. And in NBA, they have a 33% success rate. In the NFL, they have a 17% success rate. And in Major League Baseball, they have a 5% success rate. These are people, all they do is study sports. That's all they do. And the best that they do is 33% of the time get the basketball champions right. So for me, you think about, okay, all they're doing is sports, and you have a book, and it's claiming all of these things that deal with the planet, with Jesus, with the church, and these things keep coming to fruition. So for me, I'm thinking there's something to this. You mentioned about the law of cause and effect, which is a scientific law that says that every cause has an effect and every effect has a cause. Science has proven that the universe, and this is proven in several books, Tim Keller's The Reason for God, The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel, More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell, but it talks about that science has proven that the universe had a starting point. So if the universe has a starting point, if the effect is the universe, what is the cause? The universe began to exist. It has to have something that outside of the universe, because the universe is time and space and physical energy and matter, has to have something outside of that to start that. So you said a minute ago, and I appreciate this, Matt, you said we cannot conclude that there is a God, but we also cannot conclude that there's no God. That was what he said. I don't know if you mentioned it, but you noticed that. But we're not trying to prove that God exists. We're just trying to prove that we have reasons to believe that God exists. And so for me, I think we have some pretty good reasons. Where did the universe come from? So you have that. In fact, atheist and physicist Stephen Hawking said everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Well, I like that, Mr. Hawking, and I agree. It might have been a Big Bang, and when God spoke light into existence, he said, "Let there be light," and light flew out of the mouth of God at 186,000 miles per second. It might have caused some sort of a bang. I think about the biogenesis and the law of teleology. The law of teleology is a scientific law that means when there's a design, something with a design or a purpose, it has to have a designer. If I'm walking in a field and I find a wristwatch in a cornfield, I'm not going to just think, well, I bet 2 cobs of corn rubbed themselves together and a wristwatch appeared. No, somebody designed that watch. And so who designed you and me? Let's just talk about us for a second. Let's talk about biogenesis. Life, bio, genesis, the beginning. Where did the beginning of life come from? You know that this is really interesting. These are evolutionists, and many of them atheists. Famed evolutionist John Sullivan admitted it's an accepted doctrine that life never arises except from life. Evolutionist George Gaylord Simpson said the same thing. There's no serious doubt that biogenesis is the rule, that life only comes from other life, that a cell, the unit of life, is always and exclusively the product of another cell, offspring of another cell. Evolutionist Martin Moe said the same thing. Life only arises from life. So we can't rub a stick and a stone together and produce an amoeba. It's never happened in the history of humanity. So how can we take the fundamental law of biology? We're going to say that somehow, a long time ago, that life was created from non-life, and that we all evolved into what we are today. I mean, you are a miracle. Everybody in this room is a miracle. Your brain is processing over 1 million computations every single second. Your eye, scientists say, is the most computerized mechanism that we could ever fathom. There's 120 million rods and cones in your eye that are computing everything that you see around you, all these lights and the color of my shirt. You're trying to send these messages to your brain, and you're thinking, so you think we just came from nothing or from apes? Where did the apes come from? I mean, there's got to be a starting point to this life. There's got to be a genesis to the bio. Even when you're formed in the womb, when your eyes are formed in the womb, you have 100 million optic nerve endings that are coming from the optic nerve center, and they all have to find their match. Sorry, not 100 million, 1 million. They're all coming to find, and this is all happening when you're the size of an olive. And they all have to find their match. So just imagine 1 million people coming out of this door and 1 million people coming out of that door, and they have a stick that has a number on it. They have 400,222,688, and 422,688, and they're trying to find, where's 422,688? Oh, there you are. And we all have to find our match before you can sing a single thing. It's all happening when you're this big. I mean, there's just, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And I just don't think that happens from sticks and stones coming together. Or you have to have a reason. And he says, well, if we don't have a natural reason, we can't just assume a supernatural. Then give me another explanation. Is there a reason for God? Absolutely. That's reason enough. How did the world get started? How did you and I get started? Sullivan, the evolutionist I mentioned a minute ago, concluded the conclusion seems to lead back to some supernatural creative act. In fact, Richard Dawkins, who's maybe the most famous atheist of our time, said there could be, this is in Time magazine a few years ago, there could be something incredibly grand and incomprehensible and beyond our present understanding. Thank you, Mr. Dawkins. I agree. I think it's God. I think there's reasons to believe that God does, in fact, exist. Let me check my time.
You have about 3 minutes.
Okay. The last thing that you said a minute ago is you said that we need something that's detectable. And I agree. You said that we cannot conclude that there's no God. Well, we can't conclude that there is a God. We need some evidence. So for me, going back to my story when I was at the University of Texas, I'm on the campus, and I got to a point where I thought perhaps, probably, most likely God was real. Had some faith and facts to back that up. So I thought, okay, I'm going to jump in. Let's see what happens. And then I started to experience this existential side of my faith. The side of my faith that is experiential. And I agree, you can't do it on faith alone, you can't do it on personal experience. When you combine those things, it's pretty powerful. And I started to see things happen in my life, and I would pray very specific prayer requests, and things started to be answered. At my church, at Christian Life Church, at 4700 Westgate Boulevard, things started happening at my church just in the last 2 years. So at the end of a message, we'll ask people to come down and we'll pray for them. And we did a thing called Miracle Month, because if the God of the Bible, he does all these miracles, why did he stop doing miracles, right? He's the same God. So we started saying, well, let's just see if maybe, just maybe, he'll still do some miracles. So people started coming up asking for some pretty crazy things, too. Crazy, crazy things. We had a lady that came up and she said that she had gone to the doctor, and the doctor said the baby in her womb was dead. It had no heartbeat. And she was going to go in on Monday to get the fetus removed. And she said, I just want to have this baby. And she said, would you pray? That's kind of a scary prayer to pray. Like, and even my own faith was challenged, and I'm going, well, maybe I could just, well, if it's the Lord's will, he'll save this baby. That way I have an out in case the baby's not saved. It says, it was the Lord's will. The baby was supposed to die. But I just said, you know what, I'm going to pray in faith. And I said, God, I pray that you'd heal this baby. We had a whole team of pastors that were praying for this woman. She went to the doctor the next day, and just before they took the fetus out, they went ahead and ran a sonogram, and the baby's heartbeat had started again. The same thing happened, the exact same happened with Miss Martinez 2 weeks later. She had a baby in her womb. She came down for prayer. She was supposed to go in on Tuesday to get the fetus removed, and they did a sonogram, and that was last summer. And both those babies were born in January and February respectively, and they're doing great today. We had another lady named Christina Guzman who had brain cancer all over her brain. And she asked for a prayer on Sunday. She didn't even ask for healing. She said, would you just pray that God would give me a peace? And so we started praying. We laid hands on her head, and the doctors cut open her skull the next morning. And this is what the doctors said. They said, where's the cancer? And they sewed her back up and sent her on her way. The cancer was gone. Just things like this. It's just like, listen, humans are amazing. We can run 26.2 miles. We can pull cars and planes with feats of strength. But there's some things we cannot do. And there's just things that we pray. We pray for people who had job loss. A guy that had not had work in 18 months, hadn't even had a job interview in 18 months. And I prayed for him, and within 24 hours he called me and said, I got the best job offer I've ever had in my entire life, making more money than I've ever made in my entire life, because I've never been prayed for like that. I myself had an incredible story I'll share in a minute because I'm out of time. But there are reasons to believe that God exists, absolutely. Whether you believe in God or not, that's a different question. But the question today is, are there reasons? And I think I've proven there are.
Great job. Awesome. All right, that would be Reid's rebuttal. I'm going to cross over right here. Just want to unplug my phone so we don't have any interruptions. Matt, you have 2 minutes.
So I think what should be on the board is not do we have reasons, but do we have good reasons, because I think we all agree that bad reasons are bad. So the issue with prophecy, first of all, is you're going to get a different number for how many proposed prophecies and answers to prophecy there are in any particular book, whether you go to the Bible or not. The curious thing is that the Jews would point to different prophecies. They don't accept Jesus, so that all the prophecies about Jesus that Reid's convinced were fulfilled, the Jews are convinced. And the thing is, if you go into a restaurant and you order a medium rare steak and they bring you a medium rare steak, that doesn't mean they're fulfilling prophecy. And so if you have ideas that are out there in the zeitgeist, and people are actively working to do this, to achieve these things, it's hardly impressive at all that, someday Jerusalem will be restored. Well, that's not specific. It's not, in order for a prophecy to even be remotely impressive, it needs to be specific in detail, in time, and answerable by a single clear instance. It can't just be a matter of interpretation. But even if we had a bunch of those, how do we know why they match up? What's the explanation for someone being able to make a prediction and it apparently coming true? Now, I'm a magician. I've read minds for a living, or pretend to read minds for a living, because I don't think anybody can actually do it. But if I were to predict something that someone was going to do you have an explanation for it? Is it trickery? Was it coincidence? Was this, in many cases, what we're talking about is the Bible confirming the Bible. And you had 66 books by different authors written over a span of time, but it was also pieced together. So if you have this passage in Isaiah, for example, the author of Matthew was trying to fulfill as many prophecies as possible, and so when he borrowed stuff from Mark, there's a number of things that just got changed to fulfill prophecies that don't even appear in the Old Testament. When it comes to the science stuff, sorry, but I don't know if you just misspoke or if I misheard, but Lee Strobel is not a scientist, neither is Josh McDowell. Science doesn't have laws, has models and theories that are the best descriptions currently available about the universe. And so this idea that life only comes from life simply isn't true. We have an entire field of study called abiogenesis, and we've demonstrated that under some circumstances, the building blocks of life can come from non-living material, that life is chemistry and energy. Now, do we know exactly how it happened here and when? No. And that's the important thing, is there's a lot of questions that we don't have the answer to. If you were listening to him, one of the last things he said was, then give me another explanation. If we don't have a natural explanation, and we're not justified in going to a supernatural one, then give me another explanation. This is a fallacy. The idea that we should accept something because we don't have any other explanation is a fallacy. Hey, who killed that person? I think the butler did it. Well, there's no evidence that the butler did it. Well, then give me somebody else. That's not the way we go about figuring out if there are reasons. Now, I have a friend whose dad famously said that he had a headache, so he said a prayer and took an aspirin, and the headache went away. What caused the headache to go away? Most people would say, it's aspirin. Some people would say, it's the prayer. And some people would point out that maybe it was neither of them, because headaches go away. Things get misdiagnosed. Why is it that God doesn't heal amputees? Why, if he's willing to answer prayers to remove somebody's cancer, which for me is just anecdotal because I don't have the medical documentation before and after. We know that that things go into remission constantly with or without prayer. And if God is willing to show his power by curing someone who has brain cancer, then why not let's line up a bunch of amputees and have all of them regrow their limbs? Clearly that would be an obvious miracle that even I would have difficulty dismissing. I mean, you don't see stuff like that. What you hear is somebody got a job. You hear, I felt this, or this person, had this diagnosis and now it's gone. But what you don't hear is, how did you determine that the best explanation for that observation is that God did it, or that prayer works? This is the problem when we're trying to sort out prophecy. What does it mean? Here's a passage which we can interpret in many different ways, and then we find something later on that seems to match with it. How did it come to be that these two things matched? Did that person actually know? Were they informed by somebody who knew? How did we rule out time travel as long as we're going into the realm of supernatural entities? What is it that makes us think there's actually a God? Now, science doesn't have all the answers to everything. That's the whole purpose of doing science, is to get to where we have better explanations for things. So once upon a time, we didn't know how lightning worked. And there were people who would think that it was a sign from the gods, and now we have a better understanding of lightning. For basically every mystery that we've encountered, somebody has proposed some sort of godlike supernatural explanation, because that's easy to do. It is equivalent to saying it's magic. I don't understand it, I don't have an explanation, it's magic. The God hypothesis cannot serve as an explanation for anything because it doesn't expand our understanding. It is indistinguishable from saying, I don't know, it's magic. If you say, hey, why is there something rather than nothing? I don't know, it's magic. That is functionally identical to God did it. Because we don't have a definition of God, we don't have a good understanding of God, we have no evidence that God actually exists. These are all just inferences. Hey, I prayed and this happened, I'm going to give the credit to a God. hey, I think it's incredibly unlikely that this should occur. And because it's incredibly unlikely, I'm going to go ahead and say that a God did. Well, how do you know that a God is more likely than that? If you shuffle a deck of cards and deal out 4 hands, what are the odds that you're going to get ace through king of spades? They're way up there. I have them in a video. I think it's like 5 or 8 billion to 1. But what if instead of getting all 13 spades, you got 12 spades and a 5 of hearts? What are the odds of that hand? Exactly the same. What are the odds of getting a 2 of clubs, 3 of diamonds, 4 of hearts, 7 of spades, etc.? Just a hand that looks random. Exactly the same. It just seems really impressive to us that we got all 13 spades because we are imbuing those cards with significance. But the odds of getting that hand is exactly like the odds of getting any other 13 cards that were dealt out from a random shuffle. I don't deny that there is significance to life and to us, but when we infer that, oh, it just seems so improbable, therefore we must be a special creation, that's far more about ignorance and arrogance, in my opinion, than it is about an answer. Because I was on stage with Richard Dawkins last Sunday in London, and while he may be open to saying that there are broader possibilities that we might not know about, there's no way he's going to accept the possibility of a God until somebody actually demonstrates it. He might even be higher on his scale than I am at a 6.9 or whatever. I don't know if I used all 10 minutes or not.
You still have 2 left.
Cool. The last thing that was mentioned was this idea of design, of finding a watch. This was originally proposed by Paley. But the problem is this. If you believe there's a God and God created everything, then you're walking through a universe of watches, on a beach of watches, and you're picking up one watch and saying, this one's clearly different from all the other watches, therefore it must have been designed. We recognize design by contrasting it with nature. That's how you recognize design. It's not about complexity. It's not just about, oh, we know that this is designed. You compare what occurs naturally to what does not occur naturally. And it's that contrast that allows us to identify design. So if you find a watch and you recognize that it was designed, you're recognizing it because you have an understanding that these things are manufactured and not naturally occurring. You can't do the same thing with the human body. Wait a minute, it's naturally occurring. And we understand the process by which human beings evolved, and that we do in fact have a common ancestor with all the other great apes, and chromosome 2, the fusing of the centromeres in there, is probably the single greatest concrete confirmation of that, which is why even the Catholic Church accepts it. And during the Kitzmiller trial, this was brought up, and a Catholic evolutionary biology professor is the one who raised this point. There's not a conflict between the idea that humans evolved from a common ancestor and this notion of God. There's a conflict between the notion of God and any sort of rigorous scientific demonstration that it actually exists.
Awesome. Okay. Wow. Well, that is your rebuttal period. Next, we're going to go into a 15-minute response. I think it bears a little recapping so far. Just kind of breathe for a second, go back over everything we've heard. We've heard a lot so far today, right? I hope you guys copied down a lot and took a lot of notes. Should have written down something about Reid discussing the probability of prophecy in the Bible, and the cosmological argument, which is one we've talked about. Hope some of you guys wrote that down. Talked about the argument from design, which we talked about earlier, the teleological argument. We heard lots of personal anecdotes. We talked about arguments from complexity, about the complexity of life, and the probability, so I hope you guys put that down. On the contrasting side from Matt, you should have heard a lot about, or taken a lot of notes about. You can believe anything based on faith. We need actual evidence. I hope at least a couple of you wrote down what he said about extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I thought that was a good point he made about how his mom called him and told him that she bought a car. He wouldn't have any trouble believing that on faith, but more extreme claims would require more evidence than just believing it on faith. He also talked a little bit about in his rebuttal about how not all prophecies have been fulfilled, how the Jews don't believe that all the prophecies from the Old Testament were fulfilled, right? And he talked a little bit about the argument from ignorance, which we've talked about in this class, right? Just because we don't know the answers to something doesn't mean we should assume one thing or another. So I hope a lot of you guys wrote something similar to that down. I hope a lot of you started to write down a few questions at least on the back here. Don't forget, I'm going to give you guys big test grades that a lot of you need in this class for asking good questions towards the end. So I hope a few of you are thinking about questions to ask or have written some down on the back they think would be really valuable towards the end. Has anybody thought of any questions yet? A few of you have. If you're not, get those gears turning. Okay, each of you are going to have 15 minutes now for response, and then the rest of the class will kind of be like an open discussion and question and answer. So
Sweet.
This is fun. Y'all having fun? Come on. This is
They're
better
having
than him
fun.
teaching all the time. This is good stuff. Well, ask boxers or briefs. I don't care. Ask a question, get 100. This is an easy 100 for you guys. Let me just address a couple of things that Matt said. Matt, ironically, I'm a magician as well. I've been doing magic since I was 12 years old. Right after my dad died, my mom said, she said, get a job. I'm like, I don't want to do manual labor. And I said, I'll do magic. So anyway, that's something we have in common. But when I think about magic, he talked about illusions, and I do know a lot about that. I can pull a rabbit out of somebody's hat, and I can pull a quarter out of your ear, and I can make you think that I'm levitating when I'm really not. But again, I go back to the things that I have seen in my own life in the last 2 years of things that I cannot explain. Okay, I cannot do a magic trick where there's a dead baby in a womb and I make that baby come alive. Okay, it reaches a point from magic to miracle. There was another lady in our church named Margarita who had her aorta from her heart separated. She was at a UT basketball game at Frank Irwin Center. Her aorta separated. They said you have a 50-50 chance of even making it over the next hour, getting to the hospital and getting into surgery. When she got into surgery, they said you have less than a 50% chance of making it out of surgery alive. When she made it through surgery alive, they said you have less than a 50% chance of making it through the night. She made it through the night. They said you have less than a 50% chance to make it through the week. Margarita was in church on last night in service. And again, these are not people in Rwanda or Uganda or things that I'm reading on the internet. I could do that, and I could show you. I mean, he made a good point about the aspirin, and I agree. I think far too many of our prayers are to the God that I serve are minuscule. God, help me with my headache, and help me have a safe ride to Grandma's house. And that's not the way I pray, because I think that probably I could leave and make it to Grandma's house safely. And I could probably take an aspirin for my headache and be healed of that with or without God's intervention. But the prayers that I pray are big prayers, and I'll give you one that happened in my life recently. I headed up this big Christian music festival, and this was not put on by our church or by an organization. It was put on by my wife and I. It was about a $250,000 festival, and the hope was to tell people about God and reasons to believe that God exists. And at the end of the day, we raised some sponsorships, and we sold some tickets to this thing, and we came up shy about $11,000 of our needed goal. We've taken out a loan at the bank, and it was a 30-day loan. We were already 4 days into that loan process, and I got to come up with $11,000, just a small Toyota. And where am I going to get that? And I got to pay the bank back. And I thought we'd sell the tickets to pay it all off, and I just miscalculated. And so my sister, who was kind of my financial accountability partner, she said, well, let's tell people. Let's go tell the world. And I said, no. I said, I feel like God put this on my heart to start this Christian music festival, and God's going to get me out of this mess. I said, maybe in the last hour, we summon people and say, hey, we need some help paying off this loan. But I said, let's just see what God can do. So we started praying. And we had just weird, crazy, unexplainable things that would happen. I had a guy that came to my office at the church, and he said, hey man, we came to that thing, it was awesome. I thought it was awesome. We want to help you out, make sure you do it again next year. And he gave me a check for $1,500. I had no idea that we were in debt. So I called my sister immediately. I said, I was crying. I said, you're not going to believe this. We got $1,500. We're a little bit closer to the debt. And she was at her neighbor's house. Her neighbors had just moved to the city, and she was just kind of welcoming them, bringing them some cookies and saying, welcome to the neighborhood. Who are you? Where are you from? What are you doing? So she gets off the phone with me, and she's crying, and her neighbor said, is everything okay? And she said, yeah, everything is awesome. She said, my brother put on this big Christian music festival this weekend, and we ended up being a little bit in debt. Somebody just gave him a $1,500 check randomly. She said, your brother put that on? She said, our sons went to that, and they put their faith in God at that event. And so without knowing me or my sister, they gave her a $1,000 check. Again, could be coincidence. So just things like that happen. People just randomly give me money over the next 3 days, not over the next 30 days, the next 3 days. And the last little bit, it was $4,500 we were out. Exact amount was $4,500 that we needed to raise. And a gentleman named Andy, who lives in that community, who is an atheist, and he's pretty devout about his atheism. He doesn't like to talk about God. And he came to my door. It's probably the first time he'd ever been at church, as far as I know. And I thought, oh dear. He knocked on my door. And he came in and he said, "You read?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "You want to put down that Christian music thing?" I said, "Yes, sir." And I was thinking he's about to let me have it, like he's mad that I did this. And he goes, "Well, I don't believe in the God that you serve." But he said, "You filled up all of our hotels in this town, and you filled up all our restaurants." And he said, "You sold that place out." He said, "I thought it was cool. It brought a lot of commerce to our community, brought a lot of tourism to our community, and I want to help you out." He said, "Can I help you out and donate?" I said, "That'd be awesome." And he took out his checkbook. And he wrote a check for $4,500, the exact amount we were out. And I'm sitting there smiling, saying, "You're funny. You're paying this off with an atheist money." It just made me laugh internally. This is just crazy. Again, could be coincidence. But at some point, we have to stop saying this is coincidence. At some point, we have to say, okay, the aorta, the 18-month job decrease, and then we have suddenly a job within 24 hours. The 2 babies, the cancers, the magic of mind. Like, this is miracle. Right? And again, I'm not trying to prove that God is real. I'm just trying to give you reasons to believe that God is real. And for me, there were just too many things that I just said, I can't count that as coincidence anymore. You mentioned, and I may have misspoke, Matt, and I apologize if I did that, but Lee Strobel and Josh McDowell and Tim Keller, those men are not scientists, but in their books, and they have documented from scientists the evidence. I just wanted to clarify on that. You also mentioned something about the lightning. And we thought lightning may come from God, and now we know that lightning is a scientific creation, and things happen. But I want to point out some other things that we didn't know that we had a probability for. That the Bible actually said long before, that it told us what was truth, even though we believed something otherwise. From 190 to 120 BC, there was a man by the name of Hipparchus who was an astronomer, and he said there were 1,038 stars in the sky. And people just believed that for centuries and centuries and centuries. Yeah, okay. 1,038, so they just believed that to be fact. But then we built the Hubble telescope, and we know that there's not only hundreds of billions of stars, but there's hundreds of billions of galaxies in our known universe. In other words, we don't even know how big the universe is, but we know there are hundreds of billions of galaxies with hundreds of billions of stars in each galaxy in our known universe. And I love Genesis 22:17. When God tells Abram, "I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore." So written thousands of years before. Is that my time?
No.
Written thousands of years before, but forever we believe that there are 1,038 stars in the sky. For the longest time, we believed that that blood, when you got sick, that it was your blood that was making you sick. And so, you know what they used to do? Anybody know that what they used to do? They used to stick, what do they do?
Bloodletting.
Yeah, they put leeches on you to draw out the, you know that George Washington died of a common cold? They started sucking out his blood so that he could live, and he ended up dying. When Leviticus 17:11 says very clearly that the life of the creature is in the blood. We didn't know that till years later, but the Bible had said it the whole time, that when you get sick, you don't take away blood, you add blood. Blood is where the life is at. Even for the longest time, we believed the earth was flat, did we not? Until Columbus sailed the 7 seas and said, hey, this world is a sphere, and Isaiah 40:22 says that he sits enthroned above the sphere of the earth. So you have all of these things that are happening that we come up with our own human ideas of how to explain this, when the Bible all along has said, again, who could know all that stuff with 100% accuracy except the one that created it all? And I just wanted to point out that you mentioned the lightning thing, but there are other things that we had predictions on the Bible had right all along. You mentioned a minute ago about the hand of cards. And you said, what is the probability that you would have 12 spades and a 5 of hearts? The same probability that you have a completely random hand. And I agree. Okay? The probability I was talking about of 100 billion times 2 trillion times every second for 21 years regarding 11 prophecies of the 1,093 prophecies that historians and scientists and archaeologists, many would claim these are fulfilled to the letter. It would be more impressive if I predicted you're going to get 12 spades and 1 5 of hearts, and that was the hand that was dealt, rather than just dealing a random hand. So I don't know that argument actually has any weight, because yeah, I can deal a random hand, but we're not dealing random hands. We have predicted things that were written in Scripture thousands of years ago that are coming to fruition, that are still coming to fruition. Again, if I wrote a book and it was inaccurate by 1%, by 25%, it would say my book is false. But if time after time after time after time things are coming to fruition, it at least has to give you reasons to believe that God exists. You also mentioned the apes, Matt, and I don't know where I stand on evolution, but I do know this, that we have never been able to prove. You talk about science and being theories, and we've never been able to prove a change of kind, ever. There's not a change of kind, like an ape becoming a human. And it makes sense to me that if evolution is true, okay, first of all, you never answer the question of where's biogenesis, where's the beginning of life start from? We have to have a beginning point. Life can't come from non-life. It's never happened. So something outside of life has to create. The universe had a beginning point. Well, something outside of the universe has to create that universe. Is that a reason to believe that God exists? Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you may not be able to give me a different explanation, but it's certainly a reason to believe that perhaps that God exists. And so for me, it was enough to go to the factual side and say, okay, maybe there is something to God. And then I started to experience the existential side of my faith and going, God is real. And you could not convince me otherwise because of things I've experienced in my life. But it makes sense to me that if evolution was still the case, wouldn't you have somebody at the high school that's just a little hairier than the rest of you, that doesn't speak good English, is like, hey, how's it going? Like, just in my head, I think you'd still have some apes that are evolving. But everybody looks like a person, and I don't know any ape people. So we've never seen that proven. We've never seen a change of kind and evolution. So I think that you have to have faith to believe that an ape could turn into a human. And I'm asking you to have faith that perhaps that God could exist. I think there are reasons to believe that God exists, and I think I've proven that. With the law of cause and effect, the law of teleology, with biogenesis, with the law of probability and fulfilled prophecy, when you link those together, and just the personal experiences. And listen, I know my time is nearly up, and I'll close with this.
Yeah, you have 3 minutes left.
I'll close with this and say this. This has been fun, Matt, and I'd even love to buy you a cheeseburger when we get out of here. We can talk about magic. This has been
another day. I gotta go back to bed.
We'll deal. We'll make that happen. This has been fun, and I enjoy doing this. I would say this, and this may be out of the realm, but for me, when it comes to this question, I hope that you won't listen to me. If I have won this debate, you say you made some reasons to believe that God exists. I hope that you won't say, well, I'm going to believe in God because this guy came and talked and he did a really good job in his 30 minutes. I also hope that if you feel like Matt has won the debate, that you won't say, well, I don't think God exists because this man convinced me. I hope that you will study it for yourself. The scriptures say in Jeremiah 29:13 that if you seek him, you will find him, if you seek him with all of your heart. And my advice to you is to give 6 months to truly seeking God, to going to church, to reading the Bible, to praying, to seeing if there's anything to this. Because I believe God's not playing hide and seek. I don't think he's elusive. I think he wants to do things in your life, and I think he wants to answer very specific prayers. Pray specific prayers. I've had friends that didn't believe, and I said, pray something that could happen, not like you'll win the Powerball, but like that you'll have somebody that hadn't talked to you in 10 years call you. And then it happens within a month. I said, when it happens, I want you to call me. And they call me and say, okay, this is really weird. No, it's not weird. God just got in their heart. I don't know how all that works, but I think I've given reason to believe that God exists. And I believe that for 6 months, if you truly see God with all of your heart, you'll know I won this debate.
All right. Thank you so much. That was Reid's response. Thank you so much. Matt has 15 minutes or less if you'd like to take less time.
Yeah, I talk a lot, but I might not use it all this.
Sure.
So he's right, science has never found a change in kind. Do you know why? Because kind is not a scientific term. Kind has no value in science. Science deals with species, and science has demonstrated speciation, one species changing into another. Evolution takes place over grand, long periods of time, which is why we deal with fossils and DNA. Francis Collins, the former head of the Human Genome Project, who is also an evangelical Christian because he saw a waterfall frozen into three and it reminded him of the Trinity, he has said that the evidence for common ancestry from DNA alone is sufficient to justify this, even if we didn't have the fossil record. Kind is a creationist term. It's what God put the animals on the boats in kinds, sorted them into kinds. Well, you can't really say that the Bible is 100% accurate unless you go through and you cherry pick things. This idea of there being, well, first of all, you can't say, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars. That can't ever come true. It's actually impossible. There wouldn't be enough space if you had, to put everybody, if you had numerous as the stars and galaxies and stuff like that. But that's not a specific thing. To say that something is numerous doesn't tell you even remotely how many there are. Yes, there's more than 1,038. When they talk about probability, what's the probability of this happening? It's this times this times this times this times this. It just seems so outrageous. How could this possibly happen without some kind of guidance? They're actually relying on our intuition. They're relying on us saying, yeah, that seems really unlikely. Certainly a God must be more likely than that, without ever demonstrating how likely a God is. Meanwhile, what are the odds that I'm here today? Well, depending on how we want to calculate it, we have to figure out how many other places I might have been, what might have happened to me the day before that, then go all the way back to my birth and how likely my birth was. Then we have to go to my parents and figure out how likely their birth was. Then we have to go to their parents and their parents and their parents. And you will get an astronomically improbable number that I'm standing here in front of you today. And yet here I am. And there's no reason to presume that it took anything supernatural. The thing about the beginnings of life and evolutionary processes is that you don't have to make all the changes at once. The probability is based on an assumption that it all has to happen at once, like the entire human genome has to assemble at once. And in reality, what you need are self-replicating proteins that then begin to become the building blocks of life that then go on to create and evolve. Now, you might as well say Chihuahuas only come from Chihuahuas. Life only comes from life. Chihuahuas, we've only ever seen Chihuahuas coming from Chihuahuas, except that we know that all dogs are descendants of wolves. They can't interbreed anymore. And this is just in a short period of 6,000 to 10,000, 11,000 years, I think, maybe, for domestication of dogs. This is one of the issues why time keeps coming up in the discussions between the people who are opposed to evolution. It's if they can show that the Earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old, then clearly there's not enough time for evolution. But that poses an even greater problem, especially for biblical literalists, because now you have a flood, and then you have a much more rapid and impossible form of evolution, where the handful of kinds that were on Noah's Ark become all of the species in the world in rapid time. There are other problems when you start looking at here. Life is in the blood. We should have known that. We should have known not to bloodlet. There's no medical information in the Bible that is good and useful and has been demonstrated to be true. Saying life is in the blood is kind of, you might as well be poetry. The same book, by the way, has instructions for creating a potion to cure leprosy by killing doves and splattering blood around. The same book advocates for slavery. The same book puts women inferior to men. The same book has bats as birds. Now, that's probably the first time in any debate I've ever brought up the bats as bird thing, because I spent so many years believing this that I fully understand this is an artifact of the Hebrew language, and ancient people didn't have a great understanding about how to categorize things. So you categorize things with regard to homologies, with regard to how they look in comparison to each other. And so saying bats are birds is really just saying bats are flying things. However, if there's a God who inspired this book, who knew everything, why not give us a little information about the germ theory of disease instead of just saying life is blood? Why include instructions for how to create magic potions? Why the prescriptions about finding out whether or not your spouse, your wife was a virgin, why they support for slavery. Why is it that the wisdom that's in the book does not seem to eclipse the wisdom of the people who were living at that time? If God can tell us don't wear mixed fabrics and don't eat shellfish, then certainly he should be able to tell us don't own people as property. And yet the exact opposite is what you get out of the Bible. The other thing about the money that came in the music festival, I did a debate with Michael Kona on the resurrection, and he tried to make the arguments for the supernatural using Ouija boards, trash can lids, and praying for money and getting money. The weird thing is that Reid was saying it could be a coincidence, but at some point we have to stop saying it could be a coincidence and recognize essentially that there's a pattern there. No, it could be a coincidence is right. It's not a pattern until you actually demonstrate a pattern, and you don't have an explanation for the pattern until you actually demonstrate the explanation. So if I put on a festival and somebody shows up and says, hey, I really like your festival, I want to go on next year, and they give me $1,500, it doesn't matter whether they knew that I needed money. That's the type of thing people do. If you put on an event, people like it, and they want to promote this, especially if they're brought up in this culture of we need to get the word out. We have a duty and obligation. We have to fulfill our obligations under both the Great Commission and under 1 Peter 3:15 to be able to tell people, of course, we're going to get money. If you then say that this is answered prayer, and the money that comes from somebody else is answered prayer, and the atheist who writes you a check for seemingly the exact amount you need is also answered prayer, what isn't answered prayer? How do you determine that because this follows that it's caused by something? Post hoc ergo propter hoc is a fallacy. It's like, you know, hey, I had a Coke Zero for breakfast this morning and my cold got better. Therefore, Coke Zero cures colds. After this, therefore, because of it, is not a way to determine causality. You actually have to demonstrate a connection, and that requires repeated trials, it requires independent confirmation. There's a reason why science is the single most reliable method we have for understanding the world. It's not because it makes proclamations about truth, it's not because it makes proclamations about certainty. It's because the information that it provides and the models that it provides, they're accepted tentatively, they're subject to revision at all times, and anything that came out of a holy book that told us about the world still had no value until it was verified through scientific methods to be true. So if you find something in a book that says, and I go to Isaiah where he's on a spear. Actually, the Hebrew word that says not sphere, though it can be translated that way. But then you also have to explain the verse that says that there's a tree from which you can see the entirety of the world, which on a spheroid, oblate spheroid like the Earth is impossible. So if we go through and cherry pick the things that seem to have significance to us and seem to be true, yeah, you can come up with reasons to believe, but you can't come up with good reasons, because good reasons have to be taking all of the information into account. Good reasons have to say, my reason for believing this, could it also lead me to believe something else? There's a reason why there's over 1,000 denominations that all identify as Christian, and thousands of religions beyond Christianity throughout the world, some of which have died out, some of which are still around. And one might be inclined to say, oh, clearly there must be a good reason because all these people believe something, and yet we know that people have believed all sorts of things without good reasons because we found out we were wrong. We found out we didn't have good reasons. We learned more about medicine, about the human body. We know more about mental illness. We don't have to attribute it to demons. In that sort of environment, we have to draw a line somewhere where it's no longer coincidence. Give me a better explanation. I keep running against things I cannot explain, all of which you heard from Reid. And if I have any one mission in life, it's not to convince people that there's no God. It's to convince people that I don't know is often the correct answer, and it's often the best answer, because I don't know is the answer that lets you go out and find what the right answer might be. Pretending that you have an answer, becoming convinced that you have an answer that may not be right, that you have no good reason to think is right, prevents you from finding the right answer. And if that answer comes along with a lot of baggage that decreases the value of human life, that does not accomplish the sort of goals that we would want to set to make the world a better place, I think that's a big problem.
Thank you so much, Matt. They did awesome. Can we just give them another round of applause for how awesome they did? Really good. Okay, so everyone needs to look down at their sheet. You should see an area where it says conclusion. Perhaps that would be a good question for one of you to ask. What would be a good conclusion for you to take away from both of their arguments? Personally, for myself, I wrote down from Matt's side, and you have to copy me, that Matt has concluded, I don't know is often the correct answer, that assumption is not the best pathway. That's something you could write down. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask and get 100? I have a few that I want to ask to get us started. Don't everyone raise their hands at once.
Like, any question?
Any question about all this?
Good one, Mike.
Melina, go ahead first,
I
please.
mean, this is more like a statement.
Sure.
But, So, Matt, you took a lot of my questions in your rebuttal. I was like, oh, I'm gonna ask that, but then you just acknowledged it.
Sorry, give her 100 points.
But no, one thing that I noticed that you didn't really talk more about was what's it called? Abiogenesis. Can I get more input on that? On your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So you can go out and you can research this,
Yeah.
abiogenesis, but it's a field of study that is attempting to demonstrate how and when life first arose. And we don't have an answer. In the 60s, there was the Urey Miller experiment, which basically created the building blocks of life. Unfortunately, we know that the conditions that they used in their experiment did not accurately match the conditions that we know to be the case in the early Earth. So what they didn't demonstrate how life formed on the Earth, they just demonstrated that it's possible through purely electromechanical, chemical processes to get the building blocks of life to form under some conditions. The question is, how many other conditions are possible? Right now there are models that look at vents under the Earth, where there's acidic stuff and there are things actually alive in it. We may never have an answer to how it did in fact happen, but we do know that we can demonstrate at least a basic possibility that the building blocks of life and RNA and stuff can be formed through purely chemical processes without intent. I mean, yes, there's a scientist that flipped the electricity, but electricity happens without scientists' intent. And at the end of the day, even if we never found out exactly how it happened, that doesn't then we're in a position where we have to say, I don't know. You can't just go through things and say, we've looked at this long enough, we're pretty smart, we haven't found any explanation, therefore God did it. That needs its own evidence for the proposition, not just an inability to show that it's false.
May I interject something?
Yeah, sure.
You had said something about chemical processes bringing life. Why do you say that? I mean, that's not proven. Like chemical processes that can establish life.
Yeah, the building blocks of life, or self-replicating RNA.
We can't. It's never been proven that you can get life from non-life ever. And you said
That's not true.
It is true.
The Miller-Urey experiments demonstrate that self-replicating RNA, the building blocks of life, can come from non-living matter. Just because you don't get a chihuahua out of the test tube doesn't mean you didn't get life.
I agree, but you can't rub a stick and stone together and get.
And nobody in science remotely says that you
There-
can rub a stick and stone together. That's such a parody of actual science.
There has
It's
to be
mockery.
there has to be a beginning point.
Yes.
And you said we
That's
don't
what
have an
everybody-
answer for that.
Correct.
And what's interesting is that when we say, well, I don't know, and we are smart. We're incredibly smart. And we have the technology, all the technology at our fingertips, and you think about 7 billion people on the planet, nobody can give an answer for this. So, again, I'm not proving God's real. That's not my agenda today. I'm proving that there are reasons to believe that God exists. And that, in and of itself, is reason enough for me to say maybe there's something or someone who started this whole thing.
So there's 7 billion people on the planet. Let's go ahead and bump the number up on the people who live here. And the fact that nobody can answer a question means that we're justified in thinking there's a God.
I didn't say that again, my position is not to prove that God is real. I'm saying there's a reason to believe that God could have started
Okay,
something.
I'm looking for
because
good reasons,
you
not
don't-
arguments from ignorance. The fact that 7 billion people haven't been able to answer your question, we don't know why there's something rather than nothing, but that doesn't mean that we're justified in rushing to say that God did.
Okay, those are good points from both sides. Hope that answered your question. Emily?
Yeah.
Alexa, you got a question?
So you say that.
Who's this directed towards
Reid,
first?
You believe. I don't know which one of you guys said it, but you said that we believe things because of our minds, like we can trick ourselves to believe things. So because you believe in God, do you believe that these miracles happen because you believe in Him so well, or because that it really is something else? Do you think that your mind is putting that into your, like you're thinking that you're putting that own thought into your head?
Well, that'd be pretty awesome if I could do that. If I could will a baby who's deceased into living, that's pretty amazing. But I pray to a God who's unseen. I can't hear Him, I can't see Him, I can't touch Him, but I believe by faith that He exists. And we can knock the notion of faith. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. I can't see God. I can't hear God, but I pray specifically. It's not random, I need help for a headache or safe travel to grandma's house. Specific, crazy, miraculous things that we need God's intervention for. And not 100% of the time. I've got a really good friend who's an amputee. And I'm praying for his leg to go back. Because I think that would be just an amazing miracle that the world would go, I can't explain that. And it hasn't happened yet. But I've seen enough things to say, okay, there's got to be something to this. And I know that Matt mentioned ago that dogs come from wolves. And we know that that's happened over the last 10 to 11,000 years. Guess what? He has faith in that. We can't prove that. You can't prove that 11,000 years ago that this morphing happened, that now we have wolves that are now dogs. We can't prove that. So that in and of itself is a faith statement. We've never seen one creature and a change in our lifespan to another creature. We don't have documentation of that. So for us to just, so that's faith, and that's okay to have that faith. I'm not knocking that faith at all. But my faith that there's a reason to believe that God exists because I've seen things. And these are people that if you come to my church on Sunday, I'll introduce you to them. And they can tell you their story for themselves. These are not people that, again, that live in some other country that I read about on the internet. It could be some fabrication. These are people that I know, that I saw, that I've met the babies. So for me, no, it's not something I think positive feelings toward the baby. It's like these things are happening because I'm praying to an omnipotent God. That's my belief.
Reid, can I tail on that question really quick? Because
Sure.
I had one that was, I think, pertinent to that. Maybe you guys are wondering this as well. But we've talked a lot in this class about the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Maybe you guys can tell me if I'm describing it correctly, which is essentially you paint a target around the reasons you want to see that support your conclusion, right? One thing that I always think of when I think about miracles, and especially with healing, because I grew up in a lot of faith healing churches, is all the people who aren't healed, right? Would it be fair to say that you've seen a lot of people who were not healed?
Absolutely.
Okay. So my question to you, maybe some of you guys will run this as well, is why wouldn't the people who are not healed be evidence against your God if the people who are healed can be evidence for your God?
Sure, it's a great question. You know, I've been asked that question before, like why does God allow pain and suffering? Why does He allow cancer in the first place? Why does He allow a heartbeat of a baby to stop? And it's a big question, just like we can't ask God, and we don't know all the Scripture says that His ways are above our ways and His thoughts are above our thoughts. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so are His ways above our ways and His thoughts above our thoughts. I don't understand. There's some things in Scripture, you mentioned some things in Leviticus that as a human being I have real issue with, and I go, I don't like that about God. That doesn't make it right or wrong, but I don't like that. But I pray that God would turn my heart so that I would see that as just. But you mentioned the people that aren't healed. God could absolutely heal them. God could absolutely stop the drunk driver that killed my aunt and my cousin. God could stop a lazy construction worker from doing a halfway job and causing the new tenant problems. God could absolutely stop an addicted abuser who is addicted to substance abuse or alcoholism and abuses his wife and kids. God could stop that. God could stop robberies from gunmen. He could stop bullies in high school He can stop terrorists from flying planes into buildings. But here's the question, is that God gives us these free will choices, and at what point do we say, well, God, you can stop those evils, but what about the lesser evils? Like, we want him to stop robberies, but what if we want to cheat on our taxes just a little bit? And we want him to stop adulteries that ruin families, maybe some of yours in here, but we don't want him to stop the pornography that led to the families, because we kind of enjoy looking at that stuff. We want him to stop terrorism, but what about if he stopped the indoctrination that brought the theology that transformed that person into being a terrorist? We want him to stop murder, but we don't necessarily want him to stop the lesser evil acts that lead us to murder. So I would argue that the world could be much worse had God not intervened. And we may not have any healings at all. So I agree. There's some things I don't completely understand. Scripture says in Romans 8:28 that in all things God works for his glory and for our good, for those who are called according to his purpose. And for me, I want to just trust that when I pray for something and it doesn't come to fruition, that there's a bigger plan in play. I prayed my dad would come back to life because I read about a God in the Bible who rose Lazarus from the grave and Jairus, his daughter, from the grave. And I thought, why can't you raise my dad from the grave? But I can honestly tell you today, 25 years removed from that situation, that God used that situation in my life to mold me into who I am today. I would not be sitting in this class, or certainly not be serving as a minister in a church, had that not happened in my life. I just don't believe that would happen because of just some things that had happened in my life. My dad was a restaurant owner. I'd probably own a restaurant today. I'd probably be filling in the family business. I just think God has a plan that he's painting on a canvas bigger than we can see. And Scripture says that every day has been ordained for us and written in his book before one day comes to be. So I don't know why he doesn't answer every prayer request, but I do know that he has a plan for every time he says no.
All right. For time's sake, would you mind if the kids ask a few more questions?
I just want to respond to that last one.
Please.
Sure. Actually, the last one before that, before you. So it's not faith. The idea that the dogs come from wolves. I picked that example specifically so that I'm not talking about Tiktaalik, which also, by the way, is a prediction that evolution makes. Hey, if we dig in this rock layer, we know about rock layer ages, we should find something that represents a transitional form between X and Y, and that's exactly what we found with Tiktaalik. In the case of dogs, he's just flat wrong. This is demonstrable not only through DNA, but actually through records. We know when human beings began domesticating dogs because we know when they started cohabitating with wolves. We also know that humans have specifically bred different types of dogs together to get those types of dogs. This is like, to say that this isn't a matter of historical record is wrong. To say that it's not proven, I mean, you don't prove things in science, that's math, but to the extent that you prove things in science colloquially, this is as demonstrable as anything. And when he says prayer doesn't work, at 100%, he's right. And the Templeton Foundation did a specific long-term study on intercessory prayer and found that it works at about the rate of chance, which is to say it doesn't work at all. They have people pray for other people, and they find out who gets better and who doesn't. And what was damning about that particular study was that they divided it up into categories to where some of the people knew they were being prayed for and some of the people did not know they were being prayed for. And it turns out that if you know you're being prayed for, you actually get worse. They suppose that it's because there's a pressure to perform, so that you don't do anything to screw up the study about prayer. But turns out it works at the rate of flipping a coin. And that's why there's no Nobel Prize for discovering God or showing that prayer works. The Templeton Foundation keeps trying. But the actual facts and the actual science go against what you're going to hear from apologists and ministers, which is why I could no longer be one.
These are great points from both sides. Awesome. Anyone else have any questions? Daniel, go ahead, please. Who's it to?
You say you were a
Who are you asking the question to, Dan?
Okay, so you were talking about you were putting a whole bunch of people, right, into a hospital about a QT problem. So basically, you're saying it's part in the Bible. I don't know which part, but it says that Jesus Christ was in the desert and there was a whole bunch of rocks. And Satan himself told him, if you have so much power in you, why don't you just turn into water? And basically what Stan was telling him there, Jesus told him that you cannot put God into judgment. You cannot tell God to
Yeah, Matthew 4 says, do not test the Lord your God.
What's your opinion on that?
So if there's a God, he put me on this planet and gave me a brain by which I examine everything in reality, and everything is up to the test. And I'm being asked to evaluate his character. I'm being asked to consider the situation and reach a conclusion. And if this God values reason, then he should be offering reasonableness. So to say, thou shalt not question the Lord your God, is preposterous. That's exactly what we're expected to do. If anything, this is well, the book I'm working on is called If I Were God, and so does the world we inhabit make any sense? Now, I don't for a second think that story about Satan and Jesus is true, because there's no reason to think that it is, but the idea, we almost talked about morality, but we did this one easier, but I'll use an example for morality. Is something moral because God says so, or does God say so because it's moral? The Euthyphro dilemma is what it's called, related to piety, but originally, now we can do it for morality. So how do we determine whether or not something's moral? If it's merely moral because God says so, then okay, couldn't tomorrow God say, hey, go kill your kids, and that's moral? So we automatically reject that, and so the view is that something is moral, irrespective of what God has to say about it. And so for the people to believe, how did you determine that God is the good one and Satan is the evil one? What standard did you use? If you use God's standard, well then of course God comes out to be the one. But if you judge me by my standard, I'm going to come out shining too. So if we use an objective standard, how did you determine which one was the good one and which one was the evil? That is, in a nutshell, everything that I think we could say and do about this is I am in a world trying to understand it. And there are people who are saying, hey, the explanation for some events is this God thing. And I say, okay, show me some evidence for this God thing. And it's all fallacious. It's anecdotal, it doesn't stand up. And so maybe this gets to Pascal's wager, hey, if you die and you don't believe, you could be going to hell. Which hell? Which religion? If there is a God, if he's the slightest bit moral, and he hasn't shown good evidence, good reasons for believing it, then the only criteria he could judge on is whether or not I was a decent person, whether or not I used my brain and came to reasonable conclusions. But to punish someone forever for simply not believing makes him a moral monster.
I would disagree with that. We all make mistakes. Everybody in the room. We all do. And hell is not a place that God sends people that he's mad at or that he wants to condemn. Hell's a place that God says, if you want to pay for your own sins, that's where you go. It's not a place that he sends us to out of hate or spite. It's a place for people that want to pay for their own sins, because he loved us so much, the Bible says, that he sent his son Jesus to earth to die for your sins and for my sins. That I would put my faith in Jesus, that he sees me one day. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, God made Jesus, who had no sin, to become my sin, so that in a relationship with him, I might become the righteousness of God. In other words, when God sees me, he doesn't see Reid's mistakes and all my errors in life. He sees the right standing of his son. So if you're going on the good-bad scale, what's the pass-fail scale? 71%? You're the best 71% you get in? You're 51% better than you are worse? Like, that's a scary proposition. And God says we all make mistakes, and Jesus died for those mistakes. You can pay for your own sin. If I went to a restaurant and somebody said, I paid for your meal, I wouldn't go, no, I'm paying for that meal. I ate the food, I ordered it, I'm paying for it. But sir, it's already paid for. Well, I'm paying for it. I bought the meal, I'm going to pay for it. I ate the food. That is just as preposterous as saying, well, I did the sins. God's saying, listen, if you want to pay for your own sins, you can. But they've been paid for through Jesus Christ.
I'd say it's closer to getting a bill from a restaurant that you've never been to and have no evidence exists.
Well, I also want to just add that you always juxtapose science against God, and that's not always the case. There's a lot of science that proves God. You can read science
No, there's
about
not.
Peter Stoner.
There's no science or math that proves God. There's no God in this. There's no way to confirm the supernatural at all. It's an unfalsifiable proposition by definition. Now that you can still believe it, but supernatural and God are unfalsifiable propositions, which excludes them from the realm of scientific inquiry.
I would love to give you a book that would denounce that.
We have 10 minutes left. I really enjoyed the conversation so far. Tanya has a couple really good questions she wants to ask that I think could be answered very, very briefly.
Cool.
So I just wanted to let you know first, there's actually a lot of people that are like way more less developed than us. There's people born with tailbones, like the monkey tailbone. There's hairier people, and there's also people that talk way more different than a normal.
They have different
person.
mutations.
Yeah. Also, if it really is a God, why not to like settle everything down? Why doesn't he like show himself?
That's a great question. I think there is an element of faith that he wants us to have. He could make us all robots and follow him. I could make my kids love me. You've got to love me, force them. But how much more sweet is it when I come in the door and my child who has special needs, see, you're talking about deformity. My child has special needs, so I'm familiar with that. I don't think he came from A. But when he comes to the door and he greets me, Daddy, 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 it's just so much more sweet because that's a genuine love that he has for me. And I think God, if he were to just show himself, and there are instances where things that, okay, again, these prophecies come to fulfillment. I think it's God revealing himself. And I'm not so sure that when this whole thing wraps up and if the earth were to end as we know it, I don't know that God wouldn't do some grand gesture to get the world's attention. But why doesn't he do that? I think if he did that, there'd still be people that say it's a magic trick. The Bible talks about that in the end there's going to be a lot of wrath on God, and people still won't repent. Why? Because they have that mentality of God is love. Why is he allowing wrath to fall on the earth? I think even if he showed himself, if we found the Ark of the Covenant, for example, or if we found Noah's Ark, we found some of these artifacts from Scripture, and we said, this is it, here we go, there's proof, people would still say, So,
If that's the case, then there's no reason not to do it. There's no good reason not to do it if there's gonna, plus he supposedly knows what's gonna happen. I don't think you can make your kids love you. I think you can make your kids act like they love you. And I don't think any decent parent would construct a torture chamber in the basement and tell the kids that if they don't love them, that's where they're gonna go.
I agree, that's why I said that, like, I don't want my kids to force them to love me, I want them to choose to love me, and maybe that's why God does it.
And if they don't
is
choose
if
to love you, do you torture them?
If he showed up and he said, here I am, and everybody must follow me, how much more sweet is it if you just follow him on faith alone?
Yeah. And if you decide not to follow him, should you be tortured forever?
Now, that's your choice, it's not his choice.
I'm not choosing to be tortured forever. I'm just choosing to, well, I don't choose anything. I'm not choosing.
You choose to pay for your own sins.
Well, who came up with this notion of sin? Did God create the universe?
Now we're getting on the rally. Again, I don't want to miss the mark with our time remaining.
Okay.
My question is, do we have reason to believe God exists? And I think I've proven that we definitely have reasons.
Okay. I appreciate your response, both your responses to that. Did anyone else have a question before time, Juliet?
So you mentioned.
Who's this
that
to? Who are you asking?
Reid.
Okay.
So in the past, like or like a long time ago, you mentioned about how prophecies have been fulfilled. And then briefly, like really quickly, you mentioned that now there are still prophecies.
Sure.
You've seen prophecies.
Sure.
And I was wondering what you were referring to, because I know there's a part in the Bible where it mentions like, towards the end of the days there's going to be like earthquakes and floods and all that stuff. So I was wondering if it was like more like cherry picking little stuff, like to, because like if you're saying like there's prophecies being fulfilled, like what are they? Like, I don't feel it's a prophecy being fulfilled if you can use multiple situations for that instance. Like I was just wondering what you were referring to.
I want you to clarify your question when you say you want specific
So
examples.
like right now, like you're saying like there's still prophecies being fulfilled like these days, and like I don't know, it's kind of like stating like just so you're like cherry picking like certain instances to prove like the prophecy you're referring to. So I was just wondering what prophecy. So it's not like you.
So is there one being fulfilled today, October 12th, 2017?
No, just like now.
I don't.
In modern times.
It talks about it in, well, let me just read you this really quickly. This is just interesting. This is out of Luke 24. And it's talking about, it's Luke 21. Sorry.
While he's finding it, my mom thinks the eclipse is a sign of the end times, that we're living in an age of spiritual warfare. Except she doesn't realize that there were 100 total solar eclipses last year, or sorry, in the last century, and in the next century. She just happened to pick this one and the one that's coming in 2024, because they both happen to hit North America, because evidently God cares about her and where she lives, and that, so he's sending signs to her. And then a hurricane hits, and that's more signs. The problem is that this happens all the time, and always has, and you can find every failed end time prediction out there, including not too many years ago, Harold Camping was predicting the end of the world for the 7th time, so we all went out to Oakland, California and had a party, and there was an earthquake right in the middle of the party, and everybody that was there was looking around, It's the type of thing that if you're a believer, you'd be like, this was a sign. Because if you start looking for signs, you're going to find them. If you start looking for ways to make things fit, you're going to find a way to make it fit. We are pattern recognition machines. We are really, really good at it. Today is pretty much the same as yesterday. I can predict what people are doing. It's how I can do some magic effects. We're also so good at it that it makes us bad at determining which patterns are real patterns and which ones are ones that we are imposing on what we see.
I agree with you, Matt, that in the sense that signs have been happening forever. But when the signs start happening all at the same time, that's when it starts to pique my curiosity. So this is out of Luke 21, verse 25 and 26. It says, there'll be a sign in the sun, moon, and stars. Okay, we just had the eclipse, as you mentioned. Again, that was in America. I don't think God is focused on America, but just something. Something's happening with celestial beings. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and the tossing of the sea. How many hurricanes do we have this month, right?
About as many as we have every year in this season.
That's incorrect. People will faint from terror. We have the threat of nuclear warfare from North Korea. Apprehensive of what is coming in the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And we've had earthquakes in Mexico killing hundreds and hundreds of people just as early as last week. I mean, massive earthquakes. So, again, things are happening, and things have always been happening, as you said, since the beginning of time. But when they start happening at the same time, it starts to make me go, maybe something's happening that God is in control of.
Don't believe either of us. Go look up the data. The data's online about the frequency of earthquakes and their magnitude. The frequency.
And I would agree with the same thing. I would say research it for yourself.
And I think this is a great point to end the entire debate. Look this up for yourself. If you still had a question you did not get to ask today, make sure it's written down on the back of your handout. We will talk about them Monday. Unfortunately, our time is up today.
All wanted 100, man.
Yeah, you all did such a good job of paying attention and asking great questions. Right down the back.
Oh, man.
Can we get one more round of applause for our amazing speakers today? This was great. You guys are awesome. I hope you guys got a lot out of this today. Before you leave today, please put this with your name on it.